Mr. President, a number of us have been coming down to the floor for quite some time now talking about the challenges posed by China. The big geostrategic challenges for the United States posed by China. And what's happened over the last couple years, and I think is very important, is that this issue went from an issue where not many senators, 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, were talking about it, to now Democrats, Republicans, all of us have recognized that literally for the next 50 to 100 years, the biggest challenge we have in terms of national security, economic security for our nation is the challenges posed by the rise of China. And I think that that's an important course correction that we've seen in the Congress and importantly from the executive branch. The Trump administration put out a national security strategy, and that national security strategy said, yes, we still have very significant challenges with regard to violent extremist organizations like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, but long term, we are shifting to a period where the most significant economic and national security challenge we face as a nation involves the rise of great powers, particularly China, as the pacing threat. And I think the administration deserves a lot of credit for this course correction. It is in the national security strategy of the administration, it's in the national defense strategy of the administration, and I believe it is strongly supported by Democrats and Republicans in this body. Mr. President, you may have seen, for example, the Vice President Pence, gave a speech at the Hudson Institute a couple months ago. For anyone in America interested in U.S.-China relations, I commend that speech to you. It was an outstanding speech. In my view, probably the most important speech on U.S.-China relations since a former Deputy Secretary of State, Bob Zoellick, gave a speech called the Responsible Stakeholder Speech. That was over a decade ago, where Deputy Secretary Zoellick essentially said to China, you have risen in large measure because of the international system that the United States established after World War II, and you've benefited from that, and what you need to be now is become a responsible stakeholder in that system. Here's your opportunity. The system that benefited you more than anybody. The system that the United States led, China, you now have the opportunity to become a responsible stakeholder in that system. We are inviting you into it. Well, I think pretty much everybody recognizes, whether it's Trump administration officials, Obama administration officials, former Bush administration officials, that China rejected that offer. They're saying, we don't want to be part of the responsible, we do not want to be a member of the system that the United States has led. We're going to do something different. They've rejected that. And again, I think that's not a controversial statement. China experts, Democrats, Republicans, Trump, Obama, Bush, all pretty much agree that's what's happened. So, we need a different approach. So right now, there are very serious negotiations going on between the Trump administration officials and senior Chinese officials, mostly on economic issues. But it relates to broader challenges we have with China. And I've had a number of discussions with Ambassador Lighthizer, Larry Kudlow, who's the NEC chairman at the White House, Secretary Mnuchin, the Vice President, the President, on this topic. And I would say, again, because it's important not only for the American people, but for the Chinese to know that there's strong bipartisan backing for what's happening right now in terms of our reorientation of the U.S.-China relationship and what we are demanding of them. Finally, what we are demanding of them. Not everything is agreed to. There's some people, I think with good reason, have some concerns about the use of tariffs. But overall, I think there is broad bipartisan support in this body, talking frequently to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, supporting what the Trump administration is trying to do with regard to China. So, Mr. President, as they look to address these issues, and they just had these high-level negotiations just last week, I thought it would be important to lay out a couple things that I know many members of the Senate are interested in. Again, to show our backing of these negotiations, but also to make sure China knows that this isn't just the Trump administration that's focused on these issues. This is the Congress and Senate of the United States of America that also holds similar goals. So obviously the most important goal is to have a relationship in terms of economics and trade and investment that focuses on fairness, reciprocity, in terms of an open investment and trading relationship with China. Fairness, reciprocity, open trade and investment with China. We do not have that right now. That's one of the big challenges. So as they are looking to continue these negotiations and possibly come up with an agreement with China, I thought it would be important for the administration, for the Chinese to hear what a number of members of the Senate believe is important in my discussions. Let me review some of these, Mr. President. First, we need to ensure that China commits to structural changes in their economy, not just pledges to increase purchases of U.S. goods. Now, increasing purchases of U.S. goods, whether it's Nebraska farm products, which I know the presiding officer cares a lot about, or clean-burning Alaska natural gas, which I certainly care a lot about, this would be positive. But it's certainly not enough. Structural changes to the way in which they run their economy, to the way in which they treat other countries is critical. And it was good to see the President last night in his State of the Union say exactly that. Structural changes. What do we mean by structural changes? First, China, for decades now, has required American companies who invest in China to essentially transfer their technology in exchange for access to their market. Well, no other country in the world does that. China says they don't do it, they do it. They need to stop that. It's against WTO rules. Secondly, and I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail, China consistently steals intellectual property from American and other companies around the world. Third, they heavily subsidize their state-owned enterprises that gives them an unfair competitive advantage against our companies and impacts negatively our workers and our families. So again, Mr. President, number one, structural changes have to come, and if they don't, we should not accept this kind of deal. Number two, China needs to end the promise fatigue that we have had with China by enabling us through some kind of trade agreement to hold them accountable for the commitments they make. Now, what do I mean by that? We need assurances from the Chinese that will ultimately be fulfilled, that an agreement that is reached at the end by this administration can be enforced. Why is that so important? Well, Mr. President, as I mentioned, these kind of negotiations have been going on for years. Obama administration, Bush administration, Clinton administration, all in good faith have tried to get China to commit to the promises and commitments that they've already made and hold to them, whether through their WTO commitments or all kinds of other commitments. And here's the problem. The talk, the agreements, the WTO, the strategic economic dialogues with China, they all sound good, and for the most part, China has not kept its commitments. In the United States, we are suffering from promise fatigue. We get commitments from China, they make promises, and then they don't keep them. Promise fatigue. The American people, the U.S. Congress, this administration, but I believe other administrations are tired of that. And whatever agreement the Trump administration is working on should address this issue of promise fatigue. Let me just give you a couple examples of promise fatigue. Mr. President, I had the honor many, many years ago of serving on the National Security Council staff at the White House under Condoleezza Rice. We were in a meeting, I was, as a staffer to Condoleezza Rice, who at the time was the National Security Advisor, and President George W. Bush in the Oval Office with a senior administration official from China, Madam Wu Yi. She was the premier. Very important person from that country. And in this meeting, the president, as President Obama has done, as President Trump has done, as President Clinton has done, President Bush really pressed Madam Wu Yi on intellectual property theft. This is in the Oval Office. This is in a meeting in 2003, over 15 years ago. And Madam Wu Yi looked the President of the United States in the eye and said, Mr. President, we are going to fix this. Protecting intellectual property is very important to my country. We know it hurts your country when we steal it. We are going to fix this. I'm in charge. Pretty powerful. Directly to the President of the United States in the Oval Office. I witnessed this. Let's fast forward 15 years later. Have they fixed it? No. Has it actually gotten worse? Yes. Promise fatigue. Let me give a couple other examples of promise fatigue. In 2015, in the Rose Garden, President Xi of China is standing next to President Obama. And he makes essentially two commitments. We are going to stop the cyber theft of industrial products in the United States. We are going to not steal through the internet your intellectual property and other valuable trade secrets from American companies, whether it's related to defense, whether it's related to other issues. And China will not militarize the South China Sea. So this is 2015, less than 4 years ago. Standing next to the President of the United States, the President of China made these commitments in the Rose Garden. Has China kept these commitments? No. They have massively militarized the South China Sea, and they continue their industrial scale cyber theft. Great countries, particularly in these kind of settings, need to keep their word. China should know this, and a key element of any deal that we as a country strike with China needs to take into account this promise fatigue and have real mechanisms to keep their commitments. Third, we need to make sure that China commits to end its global corrupt practices. Now, what do I mean by that? Predatory Chinese infrastructure financing and bribery of foreign officials are trapping countries around the world in debt and marginalizing outside competition by foreign investors. Mr. President, there was an article recently in the Wall Street Journal that went into very minute detail of how Chinese officials at the highest levels, were bribing senior officials from Malaysia to get investment opportunities with regard to infrastructure in that country. This is essentially official policy in China to bribe and pay off officials in other countries to help their companies, which are often state-owned, compete against other companies. Is this fair? No. Is this good for the international economic system? No. Does China do it on a regular basis? Yes. Are our companies, or the United States government, engage in this kind of systematic corruption globally? No. And if U.S. companies do this, their leaders can go to jail for violating the Corrupt Foreign Practices Act. China has no such prohibitions. To the contrary, they do it as part of official state policy. So whatever agreement we have with regard to the Chinese on this issue also needs to include addressing this challenge globally of foreign corrupt practices. This kind of state-sponsored corruption should not be tolerated or overlooked. And again, in my discussions with administration senior officials, I've encouraged them to make sure this is part of the negotiations and the agreement. Finally, Mr. President, an important element of our strategy with regard to China has to involve our allies. All of the issues I just talked about, promise fatigue, industrial cyber theft, intellectual property theft, aren't just issues the United States is dealing with. They're issues that all of our key allies are dealing with. The Germans, the European Union, Japan, Korea, Canada, everybody is dealing with these same challenges with regard to China. So what does that mean? The good news is, strategically, the United States is an ally-rich nation, and our adversaries and potential adversaries are ally-poor. We have built a system of alliances since World War II that provides strategic advantage to our nation. As a matter of fact, one of the most important strategic advantages we have is our system of alliances, which we need to deepen and broaden. There are many countries in Asia, because of the rise of China, that want a closer relationship with the United States. This administration needs to seize that because it makes strategic sense for us, but they also need to coordinate with these countries as we are working on these broader global economic issues as it relates to China. Why? Because if we come to the table, not just the United States, but with the Europeans, with the Japanese, with the Koreans, with the Canadians, this provides leverage. The countries I just named, including ours, constitute well over 2/3 of the entire global GDP. We come together with these demands, we will have much more leverage to get a better deal. And Mr. President, the time is right. I've had the opportunity to talk to senior officials from all of these countries. Every single one of them has challenges like we do with regard to China. And every single one of them wants to work with us. I commend Ambassador Lighthizer for starting a alliance on trade as it relates to China on a regular basis with the EU and Japan. The EU, Japan, and the United States are coordinating on these issues. I think it makes sense for the ambassador to broaden that coalition, the coalition of the willing on these issues, but it does bring significant leverage, and countries are ready for the United States to lead on this. As a matter of fact, the number of countries and ambassadors that I've heard who have cited Vice President Pence's speech on how we have to deal with China has been remarkable. They're looking for U.S. leadership. The administration needs to provide it, but using and making sure we are coordinating with our traditional allies on this issue is vital, and that's how we're going to come to a successful conclusion. So, Mr. President, there's a lot we need to do with regard to the challenges posed by China, and they're not all negative. A lot of them can be positive. If we had Chinese investment, greenfield investment in our country, that could help with jobs, that could help ease tensions. It's something I've been encouraging Chinese officials to do for a long time. It's in their interest. I think it's in our interest. But we need to take seriously these challenges. And it is an issue. You often hear about some of the tensions or some of the conflicts that exist in this body. In my view, a lot of that's overblown. There's a lot of bipartisan work that goes on here in the Senate. The vast majority of the work that goes on here in the Senate is bipartisan. But one area of bipartisan agreement, I believe, is the need to focus on this very important geostrategic challenge that our country faces with regard to the rise of China. We're off to a good start in that regard, and I want to encourage the administration to continue to focus on this issue and focus on these 4 points that I highlighted this morning on the Senate floor. I yield the floor. And note